Greetings, friends of liberty. I have found it much in evidence in life that the saying, scratch a cynic, and you shall find a disappointed romantic, can frequently explain the actions of members of both sexes. When repeatedly disappointed in love, they become embittered. So embittered that they question their very attraction to man or woman, and amongst men lose themselves in dissolute living, or amongst women in retiring to the cloister. But we find most interestingly, in your 21st century in North America, a widespread cynicism of a different sort amongst academics and intellectuals who haven't the slightest cause for bitterness. In this book, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, prominent public intellectuals James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, in 10 chapters, analyze this intellectual cynicism and the different flavors of postmodernist, and some might say post-postmodernist thought circulating in your society today. They describe in depth the evolution of each type, from postcolonial studies to queer theory to critical race theory to gender studies and to fat and disability studies. Postmodernism began in the 1960s mainly as an evil import, not surprisingly from Frenchies like Michel Foucault, Paul de Man, and Jacques Derrida, who all simply assumed that no general explanations of the world as existed in classical liberalism or science, which explanations they called meta-narratives, were honest, but instead were rationalizations for some other motive. Postmodernism was applied most frequently to various fields of the humanities and social sciences, including psychoanalysis, linguistics, philosophy, history, and sociology, with theorists like French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who imagined that all realities had become mere simulations, and Felix Guattari, who argued that the self was being constrained by capitalist consumer society. Our authors begin by constructively defining postmodernism most simply as the expression of two principles, one epistemological and one political. The epistemological, radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable. The political, a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies. And so our authors explain that the assumed system of societal oppression that a postmodernist like Foucault imagined existed was not regarded by them as a consciously coordinated conspiracy, but the inevitable result of self-perpetuating systems that privilege some groups over others. Our authors noting that a demand that someone provide evidence and reasoning for their claims will be seen through a postmodernist lens as a request to exclude alternative means of communicating and producing knowledge. So we can immediately see how pathetic this is. Instead of responding to an intellectual challenge by proving what they say or giving evidence for it, postmodernists simply accuse you, by the simple fact of having grown up in a given society, of being biased. The irony is that in order to prove this, they would have to first show or prove that bias, and also show that they themselves are not subject to it. The postmodernists don't do that. As the authors say, the postmodern approach to social critique is unfalsifiable. In other words, it's simply the assumption that everything that people say is said for ulterior motives, either your own or those of others who you, in your ignorance and stupidity, have unconsciously swallowed. Jacques Derrida, one of these cynical stooges, is easy to remember. He started deconstruction. Derrida, deconstruction. What's that? As the authors explain, it's the bizarre idea that words refer only to other words and to the ways in which they differ from other words. So according to Derrida, words don't refer in reality to things in existence, like an actual cat or dog in the world, but instead only to other words. Those Frenchies. No wonder all they're really good at is making cheese and wine and running away when the Germans point a gun at them. Our authors articulate in the second chapter what they describe as the transition of postmodernist thought from the abstract in the 1960s and 70s to the applied in the 80s and beyond. They say, by losing the ironic playfulness, theorists of the 1980s and 1990s made postmodernism applicable to institutions and politics. After which, postmodernism was no longer a mode of describing society and undermining confidence in long-established models of reality, but instead now aspired to be a tool of social justice. One of the consequences is that teaching is now supposed to be a political act, and only one type of politics is acceptable: identity politics. In their third chapter, they list various specific applied theories of postmodernism, starting with the postmodernist treatment of colonialism called postcolonial studies. Summarizes the belief that Western society is evil because A, it had colonies, and B, sometimes treated them badly. Postmodernists focused on this since, number one, so many of the postmodernists were French, and the French, of course, had their colonies in the French West Indies and in many countries of Africa, and number two, because they were Marxist, and Marx had lectured endlessly about imperialism and its colonial exploitation. Of course, instead of being able to admit the truth that Western societies were superior in many ways to the colonial, postmodernists instead mocked these realities, saying, "We are rational and they are superstitious. We are normal and they are exotic. We are advanced and they are primitive. We are liberal and they are barbaric." But again, the reality was that this attempt to smear Western thought often backfired, since in many cases these oppositional pairs were utterly accurate. Headhunting, as occurred in Borneo and New Guinea, was indeed barbaric. Imagining that Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec god, needed thousands of sacrificed human hearts was certainly a primitive belief. Western steamships were certainly much advanced over dugout canoes, and Paul Gauguin was delightfully correct in portraying the Polynesians as exotic. In the fourth chapter, our authors turn to describing queer theory, which they define as liberation from the normal, especially when it comes to norms of gender and sexuality. This is because it regards the very existence of categories of sex, gender, and sexuality to be oppressive. Additionally, the word queer generally means anything that falls outside binaries, such as male-female, masculine-feminine, and heterosexual-homosexual. Finally, in its political orientation, queer theory seeks to unite the minority groups who fall under a single banner, queer. The authors cover, as they do, in every section, the chief theorists. In the case of queer theory, Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, and Gail Rubin. Next under their microscope comes critical race theory, the authors agreeing that critical race theory has good reasons for believing that race is purely a social construct. I would likely differ, pointing out, for example, that biologists such as Neil Risch at the University of California and Martin Feldman at Stanford have made a good case that distinct races do exist. They also agree with another aspect of CRT theory here in claiming that it pointed out that white supremacists and Enlightenment racists were self-serving in believing blacks inferior so they could enslave them. They also describe the CRT absurdity called standpoint theory. Roughly, the idea that one's identity and position in society influence how one comes to knowledge. Or, quoting Richard Delgado, a unique voice of color exists in minority status, brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. They outline the views of Kimberly Crenshaw, instrumental in developing what is called intersectionality. Here, multiple victims' status is assigned additively by any of numerous attributes such as race, sex, class, sexuality, gender identity, religion, immigration status, physical ability, and other traits. So basically, how many victim points can you claim for yourself? Standpoint theory also believes that everything the marginalized individual interprets as racism is considered racism, which the authors note encourages confirmation bias and leaves wide open the door to the unscrupulous. Having done a thorough review of CRT, they next proceed to feminism and gender studies, limiting themselves to discussing four types of feminist thought here: liberal feminism, radical feminism, materialist feminism, and intersectional feminism. These they describe, noting the increasing theoretical ambitiousness and spread of gender studies. Previously, Marxist, socialist, and other radical feminist theories saw power as an intentional top-down strategy by powerful men in patriarchal and capitalist societies. But now, gender studies is so interdisciplinary, scholars feel justified to study everything that humans typically engage in. And it is not only radical and materialist feminists who have been largely displaced by modern intersectionalists. Liberal feminists, who have always been more prominent in everyday activism than in scholarship, were also overwhelmed by the postmodern feminists. In Chapter 7, they show how fat and disability studies are evolving. From when their previous focus in the 60s was to make society more accommodating and accepting of disabled people and thereby improve their quality of life, now to the fact that this perfectly reasonable goal began to change in the 1980s. The field is so irrational that many activists actually don't want to lose whatever extra poundage or disability they have, like deafness, but instead regard the perfectly normal desire to cure deafness as wishing disabled people, rather than their disabilities, did not exist. As the authors say, these studies are currently among the most irrational and ideological forms of scholarship activism. In Chapter 8, they showcase an increasing aggressiveness and activism among present postmodernists, this intolerance often exemplified by deliberately avoiding citing white, male, and Western scholars in favor of those with some intersectionally marginalized status. Postmodern theorists like using the terms epistemic violence and epistemic oppression to make it seem like marginalized communities are being victimized if we don't believe their point of view or perspective. The purpose of these accusations being to circumvent more rigorous methods when rigor stands between them and their ideological aims. The authors conclude in their final two chapters with a more general critique of postmodernism, and also by offering at length their own solutions as to how to destroy it. The problem in evaluating this book is that it does some things really well, but others really badly. Imagine that someone were writing a history of World War II. They could focus on two possible aspects. A, describing what happened, and B, describing why what happened. Now, most people would say that the second part, describing why World War II happened, would be harder. It might involve the rise of nationalism in the West over the previous century, the Treaty of Versailles after World War I and how it punished Germany, the role of World War I in making countries more pacifistic and wanting to appease Adolf Hitler as Chamberlain did, and finally the role of the Great Depression in the 30s. So explaining why World War II happened would be harder than describing it. The authors similarly do a great job in describing the many flavors of postmodernism and their individual histories. Since that was their primary task, this is of great value to the general reader. But unfortunately, they've completely failed to explain why postmodernism emerged and is flourishing. And that's because as liberals, in trying to explain the rise of an ideology, they fail to understand that ideologies can arise for two reasons. First, an ideology can begin like Christianity did. Individuals can start a new belief system that becomes popular and spreads because people want to believe it's true. They do this all voluntarily. But a belief system can also spread not just because people like believing in it, but because the state uses force to spread it. And this, in fact, has been the dominant method utilized by many ideologies throughout history. So this is exactly what happened with Christianity itself after it became a state religion in the Roman Empire in 380 AD. Specifically, with the Codex Theodosianus, a huge collection of laws basically outlawing non-Christian beliefs or practices. As a result, a large percentage of the population then became Christian, not because they chose to, but because they had to. Another example is Islam, which spread primarily from its beginning by force and violence, its armies subsequently conquering much of the known world, inducing people who saw that military success to join and become Muslim, so they could get lots of booty and sex slaves, could loot other regions and cities, and could subject those populations to discriminatory taxation for millennia. How many people today of the 1.6 or 1.8 billion Muslims would be Muslim if Islam hadn't used violence for over a millennia to privilege its falsehoods? Would it even be 100 million? A final example of force involves the spread of communism in Russia. Before the takeover of the Bolsheviks in 1917, I would estimate, although I don't have a number, that the percentage of people who publicly identified as communist was under 5%. But after the Soviets came to power, I would bet that 95+% publicly identified as communist. Because if you didn't, or if you expressed disagreement, one of your neighbors or relatives or co-workers could inform on you, and so your life might end in a uranium mine in the Northeast or in a forced labor camp constructing dams before you died of malnutrition or exhaustion. What our authors completely fail to see is that in an indirect way, the use of state force and money is exactly how postmodernist ideologies have spread in American higher education, and from them to the wider society over time. After World War II, the government started financing higher education via massive student loans and other monies, which it had not done before. And what did the universities do with those increased monies? They created thousands of departments in all the very ideologies that our authors think began by choice, voluntarily. But they didn't, because if that huge increase in money hadn't been taken from the American taxpayer, those taxpayers would have never, ever funded all those postmodernist, politically correct and woke departments in all the various fields of the humanities, because, as surveys show, the American public overall is not woke. In addition, since the government increasingly throws so much money at students to go to college, the percentage of kids going to college has increased enormously since World War II, from approximately 5% in 1940 to 36% in 2020. So in effect, what the U.S. government did was two things. A, create woke ideology, and B, expose a huge increase in kids to that intellectual garbage, thereby spreading it. But the authors are oblivious to these economic and demographic factors because they're liberals who believe in public higher education. They can't imagine it would do such a thing. And there's also a second major factor, a second use of state force that the authors miss. And that's Titles VII and IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1991, which have created affirmative action bureaucracies to enforce their morals legislation. Bureaucracies such as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, and the Office of Civil Rights, the OCR. These huge and powerful governmental agencies have enforced racial quotas, in academia and businesses throughout the country and have shut down the speech of men in business, education, and governmental departments from the 1970s on. They are, in actuality, the compliance arm, the enforcement thugs of politically correct and woke ideology. Title VII is used by the Obama administration to create the kangaroo courts of sexual tribunals on campuses everywhere, railroading thousands of innocent men yearly and enforcing a feminist tyranny blaming all men for sexual hookups, which drunken students of both sexes often engage in. Two books I reviewed here, Richard Epstein's Forbidden Grounds and Laura Kipnis's Unwanted Advances, detail this process in full, as does Gail Heriot, who showed the increased enforcement penalties that were legislated after the 1991 Civil Rights Act. Let's finish with some miscellaneous points. A. The authors claim that social justice theorists have created a new religion, the fundamentalist religion of the nominally secular left. This is obviously false. Religions deal with the supernatural. Woke is not nominally secular, but literally and completely and utterly secular. It's a secular ideology, like the Marxism from which it partly came. B. The authors argue that once postmodernist theories became applied, they spread to the wider society, but the reality is that postmodernists saw that affirmative action law and quotas would allow them to become more activists, and so they reacted simply by becoming so. C. The authors understand that universities in Western countries are becoming increasingly bureaucratized, with power being taken away from professors and transferred to administrators, but they don't see that this is something that would never happen with a privatized system of education. Woke administrators are there to enforce Titles VII and IX of civil rights law. In K-12, for example, it's the public schools which have buildings full of administrators shuffling useless papers, whereas Catholic schools have hardly any administrators at all. D. They say communism is a great example of the human tendency to fail to appreciate how our best theories can fail catastrophically in practice. No, communism was a pathetic theory. This was pointed out by many classical liberals from the 19th century on. From each according to his ability to each according to his need is pure evil. It's a clear recipe for totalitarianism. E. They claim that the answer to postmodernism is secularism. They say in liberal societies we already have the answer to the problem of how to deal with philosophical systems that threaten to impose themselves on society. This answer is called secularism. So again, this is wrong in two respects. First, what we're seeing here is the development of a secular ideology, like fascism. It's secular. Again, they have this strange notion that everything irrational is religious. That's bizarre. Secondly, the answer, the solution to postmodernist wokeness is to protect property rights more by A, privatizing education at all levels, and B, repealing Titles VII and IX of the Civil Rights Act. As liberals, they have no clue about this. They think you can create a liberal society by violating property rights. You cannot. In conclusion, I would give this book a BB-, it getting very high marks on the descriptive side, but not understanding at all how the rise of these postmodernist ideologies was facilitated by the vastly increased federal support for public higher education after World War II, and unaware of the malign role of civil rights bureaucracies which enforce postmodernist wokeness in many types of institutions. While rejecting cynicism in all its forms, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.